Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew, and tonight I'd like to welcome a member of the World Archaeological Congress, a world-renowned author, lecturer, and researcher, Michael Cremo. How you doing tonight, Michael?
Pretty good, Chris.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. And I'd like to start, as usual, with a little bit of your background and what brought you down your current path.
Those are, very good questions. Of course, my topic is forbidden archaeology. That's the name of my most famous book, and it's kind of become a generic kind of title, just like Xerox became a generic name for copying machines. So, that title, Forbidden Archaeology, started getting used a lot. I should say something about my background. I was born in the United States. My father was an intelligence officer in the United States Air Force. And, that meant a couple things for me as I was growing up. One thing it meant was our family was moving around quite a bit from place to place in the United States and also foreign countries. So as I was growing up, I got exposed to a lot of different worldviews and cultures. And I became particularly interested in the spiritual culture of ancient India, and eventually got very deeply into the study of the ancient Sanskrit writings of India, which contain accounts of human populations, human civilizations existing on Earth millions and millions of years ago, going all the way back to the very beginnings of the history of life on Earth. So that was something quite different from anything I'd learned from my teachers in high school or university. There I learned, that human beings like us appeared fairly recently on Earth. At that time, they would say within the past 100,000 years. Today, they would say, maybe about 200,000 years. And before that, they generally say there were no human beings like us on Earth, only more primitive ape-like human ancestors. So this idea of extreme human antiquity is something that's found not just in the ancient Sanskrit writings of India, but in the writings of many of the world's wisdom traditions. So I had to think about that. How was I to regard these accounts of extreme human antiquity? As mythological, as poetic inventions, or was there perhaps some factual basis for them? So that's what got me looking into the history of archaeology. Of course, if you open up the current textbooks of archaeology or anthropology, you're only going to see the facts. You're only going to see the evidence that supports the now dominant idea that humans like us appeared fairly recently on this planet. But I decided I was going to look beyond the textbooks. And here again, it may have been some influence from my father's profession as an intelligence officer. I grew up understanding there are such things as secret knowledge, forbidden knowledge, things that are true, but which the general public is not aware of. So I thought, let me dig into the original reports by archaeologists and geologists and paleontologists, other scientists who are digging into the earth, and let me see what they're actually reporting. And when I did that, I was really quite surprised. I mean, initially I thought, okay, I'll do 8 days of research, I'll write a little article about it, and I'll move on to something else. But when I started digging into these original reports from the time of Darwin all the way up to the present, I found that many scientists were reporting finding human bones, human artifacts, human footprints that go back much further in time than 1 or 200,000 years. In some cases, many millions of years. So the 8 days of research turned into 8 weeks. The 8 weeks turned into 8 months. The 8 months turned into 8 years, because there are literally hundreds of these cases reported in the scientific literature of the past 150 years or so. So that's how I got into this topic. I collected all those reports and published them in the book Forbidden Archeology. And since that time, I've continued with that research and research in related fields related to the whole question of human origins and our place in the universe.
Very good. Now, why do you think all of this information is so suppressed? Why do you think it's so different from what they've taught us in our history books and throughout our schools and basically throughout our whole history? It's different. The more you start to research this, the more you start to realize that it is completely different than the history that they're teaching us.
Yeah, I think there are a few reasons for this. One is it's just human nature. For example, if I love somebody and somebody tells me something bad about the person I love, I don't want to believe them. I may even become a little angry at the person who tells me these things. So scientists today are very much in love with their theories, and if they hear something that contradicts a theory that's very deeply respected or even loved within their institutions, they become upset. That's one reason. And there's deeper reasons that have something to do with power. You know, there are different kinds of power in the world. There's military power, there's economic power, there's political power, and there's also intellectual power, which is a very subtle power, but a very real one. And what the people who possess this power are able to do is they're able to define our existence, define our identity. And if you're able to define a person's identity, then automatically, if that person accepts the identity you've assigned to them, then they will naturally develop values, goals, and behaviors that are consistent with that sense of identity that's been imposed on them. So what science has done today is impose a very materialistic conception of identity on us through their control of the education system. Basically, they're telling us you're machines made of molecules in competition with each other for survival. And because basically we buy into that sense of identity, then our goals become extremely materialistic. We think to be a good producer and consumer, of more and more material things is the main purpose of human life. And we get entangled with political, financial, cultural, and even religious institutions that are based primarily on those extremely materialistic concepts. And as part of those institutions, we generate tremendous amounts of wealth that flow in unequal in an unequal manner to the people who are actually controlling that system. So I think one reason why there's so much resistance to this archaeological evidence for extreme human antiquity and many other categories of evidence in different fields of knowledge related to what we might call the paranormal or the alternative or whatever name you want to put on it. I think the reason why there is such resistance to these categories of evidence is because they lead to a new understanding of our human identity. They lead to new explanations for human origins that tend to involve non-material principles. So I think there's a whole combination of factors that are responsible for why this kind of evidence, the kind of evidence that I'm talking about, is resisted. As I said, not just in the field of archaeology, but in fields like parapsychology, evidence for extraterrestrial life forms, and whatever.
I agree. That was an excellent explanation there. And you, based on your research, there's the possibility that we could go back, like you said, millions of years. Now, how far do you think we go back? And are we originally from this planet?
I would say we go back to the very beginnings of the history of life on Earth, because I think this Earth, this whole universe actually, has been made for a certain purpose. I think originally we're all extraterrestrials, and this has something to do with the nature of consciousness. Now, many scientists today will say that what we call consciousness is just the result of some bioelectrical activity in the brain. And at the time of death, when the chemicals in the brain become disorganized, they would say there's no more consciousness. So under that point of view, we're purely material beings. Temporarily, we're conscious, but at the time of death, it goes away. I don't accept that. I think consciousness has its own existence independent from matter. It can come into association with matter, but it's not produced by matter. And I give a lot of the scientific evidence for that in a book I wrote called Human Devolution, a Vedic alternative to Darwin's theory. And the basic message is, as beings of pure consciousness, we don't evolve up from matter. We devolve or come down from some higher level of reality, which is where we really belong, because consciousness in its original form has neither beginning or end. There's no birth, there's no death, everything exists eternally. But because we're not fit at the present moment, we're not qualified to exist on that level, this world of matter has been provided for us as a place where we can act out our desires to dominate and control matter. And also, it has a dual purpose. It can be a learning experience that will help us understand our real nature as beings of pure consciousness. So I would say we've been around the human form of life, which I understand to be a vehicle for a conscious self existing in the world of matter. That human vehicle has been available since the beginning because the universe has a purpose. It's sort of like if a company makes a computer, it doesn't just make a computer and hope somewhere down the line human beings capable of using it are going to evolve somehow. It makes the computer because it understands there are customers for it existing right at the present moment, and it's designed with that in mind. So similarly, I would say our universe is not an accident. It's a very sophisticated artificial or virtual reality system that has been designed with us in mind. So we're there since the beginning.
Very, very fascinating. Now,
And we're all extraterrestrials in the sense that as beings of pure consciousness, none of us are from the world of matter. Sorry to interrupt there.
oh no, that's okay, because that's fascinating. Now, you were talking about consciousness, and I'd like to talk about the evolution of our consciousness, if we'll be able to be possibly as evolved as previous civilizations. But first, let's talk about that. How advanced were these previous civilizations?
Well, if we look at the accounts of them that are given in different ancient wisdom traditions, we could see that in many respects they were quite advanced. Now, you have to have some kind of definition of what you mean by advancement. And I think you can take that in two ways. One way is the way that we tend to think about it. Did they have high tech stuff? Did they have developed technology, etc.? Another way to look at advancement is that people may have been living in a more simple and natural way. Maybe they were dealing with more subtle energies than we're accustomed to dealing with. But I know from my studies of the ancient Sanskrit writings of India, it describes civilizations that existed millions of years ago. And according to those accounts, there were cities, they had uh, spaceships and flying craft they called vimanas. They had weapons resembling modern nuclear weapons. They were called brahmastras. And they had a developed science of medicine. They understood things about human biology. For example, that the embryo starts out as a single cell, a fertilized egg, and that it splits into two and then four, and so on. Things that weren't understood in Western science until the invention of the microscope, and they started doing detailed anatomical studies. So there are signs that these civilizations were quite advanced in, in, in those terms.
Now, was there any type of physical evolution, as in like the theory of evolution going on, or were we always type sort of evolved, or was there any type of genetic engineering going on?
You know, it's an interesting question. Uh, in one sense, I would answer the question with a no in this sense that the full range of bodily vehicles has always been available for conscious selves. That's the important thing to understand, is that any type of body, whether it's a human body or an ape body or a plant body or a fish body, a bird body, a dinosaur body, they're all vehicles for conscious selves according to their level of awareness. So I would say the full range of bodily vehicles has always been available, and it's possible for a conscious self to evolve in the sense that in one lifetime it may be in the body of a primitive ape or monkey. In the next life, it may be in the body of an ape man, some kind of hominin. In the next life, it will be in the body of a human being. In other words, there can be an evolution of the conscious self through different kinds of bodily vehicles. And in each bodily vehicle, it's able to express itself to a greater or lesser degree. A conscious self in the body of a tree, for example, is going to be very limited in the manner in which it can express itself. The same conscious self in a human bodily vehicle is able to express its nature and abilities to a greater degree. But with that ability comes some responsibility, to do it in a proper way. Otherwise, one might lose the license for operating that human bodily vehicle and be put back into a kind of bodily vehicle where one will be more restricted.
So would you say it's sort of like we're in a training ground of sorts, that if we don't learn to evolve our consciousness, that it could hurt us?
Yeah, we accept the results of our actions. According to the spiritual tradition of ancient India, there's something called karma. What goes around comes around. What you put out gets reflected back to you in some way, either in this life or in a future life. So if one is causing harm and suffering to other living things, eventually that's going to come back on one in one form or another. But there's also an opportunity in this human form of life to understand our higher nature as what I call beings of pure consciousness. And if we put our energy into that, then we can get promoted to that higher dimension or level of existence beyond the actions and reactions of the world of matter, beyond the cycle of birth and death in the world of matter. We can be on a platform that's beyond all that. So that opportunity is there. You know, there are different systems of prayer and meditation and yoga in different wisdom traditions that are ultimately dedicated to that. But you know, the forces that are now governing human society aren't very much interested in that. They would rather just keep us all engaged in being good producers and consumers of material things, competing with each other individually and collectively, and
Yes, I
being
agree. It's all
exploited.
about. It seems to be about the suppression of our consciousness. You know, through the food we eat, to everything we see on TV and technology. It seems like they are definitely trying to suppress the capabilities of our consciousness.
I would agree with you on that point, but it's there are networks of people and groups and people trying to communicate in different ways a different message. So that's a hopeful sign.
Yes, definitely is. Now, I wanted to talk to you about your research into the possibility of giants. Now, for you, based on your research, were we a lot larger in previous civilizations?
Uh, yes, the research that I do, as I've said a few times, is very much inspired by my studies in the ancient Sanskrit writings of India, which are based on a cyclical concept of time. I mean, we understand something, each one of us, about cycles of time. There's the day-night cycle. During the day, we're usually awake. At night, we usually go to sleep. We're aware of the seasonal cycle, you know, spring, summer, fall, winter. You know, we play different sports in the different seasons. We dress according to the season, eat certain foods according to the season. But ancient people were aware of even larger cycles of time. In the Indian system, there was a cycle called the Yuga cycle. There were a cycle of 4 ages or yugas. It started out with a golden age, and then another age in which things gradually deteriorated, you know, by 25%, and then a next age where things became further deteriorated, and finally a dark age called Kali Yuga, where things become very uncomfortable. And that's the age we're in now, according to the ancient cosmological calendar. But before this age of Kali, which began about 5,000 years ago, according to these accounts, living things, including human beings, were bigger than they are today. And you know, I live in California, and in the Sierra Nevada mountains, you know, we've got the California redwood trees, which are the largest living things on Earth. Some of them are 300 feet tall. They're so wide. Some of them have tunnels cut through their trunks that cars drive through. It's really pretty amazing. And some of them are thousands of years old. So I think they're kind of holdovers from that previous age when living things were bigger than they are today. And it's even part of just standard zoology and paleontology that before 5 or 10,000 years ago, you know, the tigers were bigger, the bears were bigger, the elephants were bigger, it's pretty much standard science that most living things, and I would say that would include human beings, were bigger than they are today. And there are lots of reports of large size human bones and skeletons having been found. There's a researcher I know, Jim Vieira, who kind of specializes in that kind of evidence. The difficulty is that it's very hard to physically verify the existence of some of the huge bones and skeletons that have been reported. And unfortunately, a lot of the pictures that we see circulating on the web about these things are Photoshop collages and things like that. It's very difficult to track them down. But I think there is some good scientifically reported evidence for these things. There was a scientifically reported case from France in the latter part of the 19th century from a place called Castelnau in southern France. And there, a French archaeologist, a Dr. Lapouge, found large-sized human bones, not complete skeletons, but he found a femur or a thigh bone of a human being of large size. And anthropologists, if they know how big the femur or thigh bone is, they can measure it, and from that they can tell how tall the human being that had such a thigh bone was. And in the case of these particular bones, which were published in a scientific journal along with photographs of them that appear to be genuine, the scientists concluded that the human being with a thigh bone or femur of this size must have been over 11 feet tall, which is pretty good.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there are a lot of reports of human skeletons 7 feet tall being found, but there are living people today who are 7 feet tall. They're on the NBA basketball teams. There are even a couple of people living on Earth today who are between 8 feet and 9 feet tall, but there is nobody 10 or 11 feet tall. So I thought that case from France was one of the better documented cases, and it would be really interesting if somebody could track down in a museum in Europe the actual bones, the photographs of which were published in scientific journals in the latter part of the 19th century and early part of the 20th century. So I personally accept that in the past, humans were present who were much taller, much bigger than they are today. And as I said, there are a lot of reports of such things, but they're difficult to verify and track down and locate the specimens today.
Yeah, speaking of that, I mean, you hear the rumors how they may have hidden artifacts under the Smithsonian or even the Vatican. Have you done any research into that, about the possibility of them hiding giant bones or secret artifacts?
Well, part of the work I do is going into museums and verifying the existence of archaeological evidence for extreme human antiquity that isn't shown to the public. Now, I'm not able to do that in every single case, but it's part of what I do. I mean, I'll give you an example. One case that I've always found very fascinating is the California gold mine discoveries. In the 19th century, gold was discovered in California. Miners came there to get it. They were digging tunnels at places like Table Mountain in the Sierra Nevada mountains in California, near the town of Sonora. And deep inside the tunnels, the miners were finding human bones and human artifacts. And these came to the attention of Dr. J.D. Whitney, who was the chief government geologist of California. And he collected these artifacts and gathered information about their discovery and conducted his own research. And he published a report about these discoveries. It was published by Harvard University in the year 1880. And what makes these things so interesting to me is they were found in layers of solid rock that modern geologists tell us are about 50 million years old, which is really quite extraordinary. But, we don't hear very much about these discoveries today because of what I call a process of knowledge filtration that operates in the scientific world. There was a contemporary of Dr. Whitney's, a Dr. William Holmes, who was an anthropologist working at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. So he was a more prominent scientist. And he said, if Dr. Whitney had understood the theory of human evolution, he wouldn't have published that report. He wouldn't have come to those conclusions despite all the evidence he saw. In other words, if the facts did not support the dominant theory, the facts should be discarded, cast into oblivion, forgotten. And basically that's what happened. But some of the artifacts from the California gold mines are in the collection of the Museum of Anthropology at the University of California at Berkeley. They're not shown to the public, but a few years ago, I got permission from the directors of the museum to study and photograph them, and they are still there. So in that case, I was able to verify the existence of some of these 50 million year old human artifacts from the California gold mines. Another case where I was able to enter into a museum and verify the existence of archaeological evidence for extreme human antiquity was in Portugal. In the 19th century, there was a Portuguese geologist named Carlos Ribeiro who found hundreds of human artifacts, stone tools, and weapons in his country in layers of rock 20 million years old. So he displayed those artifacts in the Museum of Geology in Lisbon, the capital of Portugal, with labels indicating an age of 20 million years. After he died, his colleagues in the museum did something interesting. They left the artifacts on display, but they wrote new labels for all of them, giving them ages of about 20,000 years. So they thought 20 million years, that's impossible. 20,000 years, that sounds about right. And then the next generation of officials in the museum in the 1940s and 1950s, they just put the entire collection away, no longer displayed. So I went to that museum. I was able to get access to them, study and photograph them, and I was able to confirm the existence of these artifacts. So it's not exactly like, you know, Raiders of the Lost Ark or something where they find the Ark of the Covenant in the storehouses of the Smithsonian Institution. But there is stuff in museums around the world. There is archaeological evidence for extreme human antiquity in the collections of museums around the world. And part of my work involves verifying that and uncovering that evidence. That's part of what I do.
That's very fascinating. Now, all this evidence the lack of evidence, there seems to have been resets throughout history that seem to have erased a lot of the evidence of advanced civilizations. Would you agree to that?
Yeah, I would. I think in the course of cyclical time, there are periodic devastations that wipe out quite a bit in terms of the living things that are existing on the earth before those devastations. And it also tends to result in the destruction of a lot of the archaeological evidence. But I think the earth is repopulated from a higher level of the cosmos. It's kind of something like cloud computing. Like a lot of people and companies today keep all their files and pictures and songs and stuff like that on the cloud, so that if their device gets broken or stolen, everything's still in the cloud. So when you get a new device, you've got access to all of your programs and files. So I think the universe, the cosmos, is set up something like that. There's kind of a higher level of reality that has all the resources necessary to repopulate the earth after these periodic devastations take place. In the ancient Sanskrit writings of India, it says there have been 6 devastations over the past couple of billion years. And modern science, surprisingly enough, modern paleontology says that over the past couple of billion years, there have been 6 major, what they call extinction events. The last one being the one that wiped out the dinosaurs about 65 million years ago. But there's another factor that has to be considered, even apart from these periodic devastations that take place, and that is that a lot of our high-tech stuff doesn't survive very long over the course of many hundreds of thousands or millions of years. A few years ago, there were some scientists who were interested in environmental questions. I mean, obviously, our technological civilization, our industrial civilization, has had a big negative impact on the environment on this planet. So these scientists were wondering, well, what would happen if human beings disappeared from the earth today? how long would the remains of our technological civilization be there? How long would it take the Earth to restore itself to a natural state? And they said, after a few thousand years, most of our metal stuff will have oxidized. I mean, our cars, our airplanes, they're made of metals that oxidize. You know, iron will rust, things like that. Even steel, after a certain point, it starts to corrode. And as far as anything else, I mean, there'd be fires, there'd be floods, there'd be tsunamis, there would be all kinds of forces that would degrade even huge cities, so that after a few 100,000 years, not much would be really left. Although we kind of think of it as very hard technology, it really doesn't last a long time. So at the time of those California gold mine discoveries, say 50 million years ago, there could have been people with computers and smartphones and people using stone tools and things like that. But after 50 million years, what would be left? The stone tools would still be around, but the computer wouldn't really last that long because most of the metals would oxidize, the plastic will dissolve. So, but there may be a way to detect the remains of a high-tech civilization, and that would be by searching for the remains of alloys that don't occur in nature, that have to be manufactured by humans. But you'd have to do some spectrographic analysis of the remains of these things. You wouldn't expect to see a computer, but if you did very detailed spectrographic analysis of the minerals, you might find compounds that don't occur in nature. So that might be one way to detect the remains of a high-tech civilization. Of course, another kind of evidence is the records left by these ancient civilizations. As I was saying, the ancient Sanskrit writings of India, which according to the tradition have been handed down from generation to generation over millions of years, contain descriptions of, as I said, spacecraft, aircraft, highly developed weapon systems, things like that. So that's a different kind of evidence.
Wow, very interesting. Do you think we're headed towards the next reset or possibly towards a new era?
Well, I think a lot depends on us. A lot of people, based on their perhaps mistaken understanding of the Mayan calendar, thought there was going to be a major devastation, a major reset, you could call it, in 2012. Now, I think such a thing is going to happen. I think there is going to be another devastation, but it's, according to the cosmological calendars of ancient India, it's not going to be very soon. We're in an age, a yuga, the Kali Yuga, that's predicted to be a time of increasing social and environmental disturbance. And I think we can see a pattern like that. But just because it's going to rain, it doesn't mean you have to get wet. You can shelter yourself, you can shelter others that you care about, and that's always possible. I mean, the way that I look at it is there's basically two kinds of conscious selves in the material universe. There's one type of conscious self that's trying to get more and more deeply involved and entangled in trying to dominate, control, and exploit matter and other people. And then there's another type of conscious self who's trying to understand, I'm a being of pure consciousness, you're a being of pure consciousness. Let's try to figure out how to satisfy our material needs in the most simple, natural, efficient, and fair way possible, while putting most of our human energy into developing this resource of consciousness. So, based on the relative numbers of conscious selves in either one of those categories, we're going to have a certain type of human civilization. And I would say, the mainstream institutions are now pretty much based on trying to get more and more deeply involved in domination, control, exploitation, selfish motivation, and so on. But there are groups of people who are trying to develop a more conscious and aware way of relating to each other and existing. So, I mean, eventually, if there are enough such people, then the institutions of society, the educational, the political, the financial, and economic institutions will be organized on the basis of those principles. That's not the case today. So the people who are more on the consciousness side of things are just going to have to find each other and create their own alternative institutions and ways of dealing with each other and existing in this world.
Do you see a time where we move into an era where as a planet we can evolve our consciousness?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's coming. It could happen. As I said, it depends upon how many conscious selves make the kinds of decisions that I was talking about. But just by the nature of the changing of the yugas, a more positive time will come. Just like in the year, there's spring, there's summer, there's fall, there's winter, but after the winter, another spring comes. So, according to the ancient Sanskrit writings of India, after the age of Kali, which is the age or yuga that we're in now, which is predicted to be a time of increasing social and environmental disturbance and degradation. After that is over, in about 400,000 years from now, there will be another golden age where everyone is on that platform of pure consciousness. But meanwhile, we have to take whatever opportunities there are. It's kind of going against the flow of the age, but as I said, just because winter is coming on, it doesn't mean you have to freeze to death.
Yes, very good. Now, I have one more question before we close out. Have you done any research into possible parts are out-of-place artifacts in Antarctica?
That's one place I don't have a lot of evidence from. One interesting thing, however, I have looked into, and this comes from the work of a researcher named Charles Hapgood, who wrote a book called Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. And he located a map that came from a museum in Turkey. It's several hundred years old, from around the time of Columbus or so. And he says it's based on even more ancient maps. But what's really interesting about it is it shows the outline of the continent of Antarctica as it exists underneath the ice, because now Antarctica is covered by ice, and that ice extends in huge shelves, ice shelves that go out into the ocean. So that, if you were looking from a satellite today and you trace the outline of Antarctica, it wouldn't really match the underlying continent itself if it wasn't covered by the ice. So that's really a pretty amazing thing, that someone would have had the idea of what the continent of Antarctica looks like under the ice and draws a map of it. That would tend to indicate that someone was around at a time when Antarctica wasn't covered by ice. And according to geologists and paleontologists, that would have had to have been millions and millions of years ago, because there was a time when Antarctica wasn't covered by the ice cap that it's now covered by. So that's a kind of artifact. It's not something that's been dug up in Antarctica, but it's really suggestive of the fact that people were around at that time and they knew about Antarctica and they were able to map it. Now, that would tend to indicate that there should be some archaeological evidence down there. And I've heard that, if you look on the web, you can find reports of such things. But in terms of being actually able to verify them, which I like to be able to do, it's a little difficult.
Yes, it is very difficult. There's a lot of mystery that surrounds Antarctica. And Mr. Cremo, I want to thank you again for joining us tonight. That was some amazing information. I'd love to have you back on sometime. And I really appreciate you coming on, and thank you for joining us tonight.
I really appreciate the opportunity to be on Forbidden Knowledge News with you, Chris, and all of your viewers. And I hope I do get to talk to you again.
Yes, very much. We will have you back on. I appreciate that. And you have a good night, Mr. Cremo.
You too, Chris. Good night.